what makes you think that welfare or DI is any form of reparations when it's not even specifically targeted to Black Americans?
So 2 questions there, and I'll try to answer both. The first is, of course, talking about a historical fact, it doesn't make you a victim or anything. Of course, I would never make that argument. The problem is when you cite historical facts that only paint one side of the picture and say that some 250 years later, that means that the people that weren't directly suffered under that now are perpetual victims. That's where the sort of cultural Marxist oppression narrative comes. Similarly, I don't think I'm a racist if I want to talk about Black crime statistics. I could use those crime statistics to then paint a racist, I don't want any Black people in my community. That would be a way to make that racist. So I have no problem with people addressing it. It's the fact that they have an agenda to paint Blacks as an oppressed group and say that they're entitled to things, and they point to that historical facts. We could point to the historical facts of the treatment that Africa did of the African people themselves and talk at great lengths what likely would have happened to the ancestors if the transatlantic slave trade never occurred. We could, while we're talking about U.S. slavery, mentioned that there was slavery all around the world, and it's not that they created it. We could say even in the transatlantic slave trade, the vast majority of it went to South America, which is people that we would consider more Hispanic than whites. But all that's left out, and there's this hyper focus that's put on the European descendant countries largely, that they somehow are responsible for the sins of their forefathers, and we have to be ashamed. I'm not ashamed. I'm very proud. Although there are dark spots in the history of the United States, it's the greatest country ever created and has led to the point we are now. And I'm glad we could fight on the same side, pushing right as opposed to left, but I'm tired of the narrative that it's something we have to be ashamed of and hyper-focus on only the negative. To the second question, the idea of welfare, I just think that you're fundamentally incorrect. So I crunched some numbers here. We can go through them if you like. So according to the U.S. Census Bureau program, we can see that on average, white non-Hispanics pay about $3,300 to $4,000 more per person in federal taxes than Blacks a year. However, when it comes to welfare programs, the U.S. Census Bureau and the Urban Institute for Congressional Budget Office shows that Black Americans receive on average roughly $2,500 to $4,000 more per person per year in total government benefits. So if we take on average over the past 50 years that there are 30 million Black Americans and multiply it by the lowest estimate, $2,500 a year that each individual gets more than whites, and that comes to $75 billion a year that's flowing into the hands of Black people. Multiply that by 50 years and you have $3.75 trillion is how much we've paid in reparations to the Black community. Now, I think when you rightfully looked at the idea of giving every Black $250,000, you said that would bankrupt the country. You know how much that would total? About $10 trillion. So your reparations plan alone that we currently have in the status, I'm sorry, the plan we already have in the status quo is already $3.5 trillion that's flowed to Black Americans. How is that not reparations, and why don't you talk about it?
Because welfare is not specifically targeted as a government instrument as an apology for the $236 billion that slavery as an institution created. And it's so interesting that you want to try to pull those statistics when the facts are that the amount of money lost by Black Americans through economic exclusion, like as well talked about in the book, The Color of Law, where the FHA and banking institutions wouldn't even approve loans for Black Americans if they wanted to live in a certain area. So what they did was systematically exclude Black Americans from the real estate game, and home ownership has always been proven to be one of the largest guarantors of generational capital and generational wealth in the history of the country. And even if I never gave you a reparations plan. All I said was we shouldn't get the $250,000 because it would bankrupt the country. And I don't want our currency, the dollar has already been deflated 97%. I don't want the dollar to get any worse. So that's not the plan I would have. I didn't offer a plan. So don't say that I did.
No. You said some things you would do, like education, land grants, etc. That's what I'm talking about.
I said I would look at a targeted education plan with a partial cash payment and land grant initiatives. I said a multiplicity of things. Did not name a number on how that would get done. But the idea that welfare, which goes to what? Low income Americans. The idea that something which is supposed to serve as the same, a very, very skeletized version of Daniel Patrick Moynihan's universal basic income plan, which was picked up by Nixon in the 70s. And Nixon, who was a Republican, attempted to pass a UBI to assist Black Americans, and it passed in the House and failed in the Senate because it didn't get enough Democratic support, would have actually been quite fine. But we didn't even get that. Welfare is a system to help you subsist. It helps with sustenance, but it's not. Reparations would actually help Black Americans truly pull themselves up by their own bootstraps by providing the laces. King is quite often quoted as saying it's all right to tell a man pull himself up by his own bootstraps, but it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man to pull himself up by his own bootstraps. And it is undeniable that American economic and legal policy systematically economically excluded African Americans even within the last 60 to 70 years. My grandmother was born in the I believe it was in the 1920s. She witnessed actual economic disadvantage because of segregation. So even if we relegate a reparations plan specifically within that time frame, the economic disparate impact of those policies can still have a net negative economic effect today, which is exactly what we're seeing. And this idea that Black Americans are receiving more welfare, I just wanted to comment on this very quickly. That stands to reason that would be the case, because the white Americans are employed at a rate of 65%, and Black men it's around 57 or so. I'd have to fact check that to be certain. But there's a lower percentage of employed Black Americans, which would also stand to reason why they would be higher welfare recipients when you look at the per capita numbers. It doesn't, however, that doesn't make that a reparations plan at all.
Okay, so two things. It sounds like what you're saying is that the key distinction is you have to specifically say this is an apology for slavery when the money's being dished out.
No, that's not the only thing that I'm saying at all.
But it seems that that's the key point.
That's not enough. That wouldn't be enough money, period, first of all, based around the economic capital that slavery itself generated. Again, slavery generated $230 billion for the U.S. economy that slaves got no percentage of. None. That's not,
but nonetheless,
if, not the same thing.
If they've received $3.75 trillion in the past
all Black
50
Americans
years.
Received?
What's that?
Have all descendants of chattel slavery received any piece of that money? No.
It wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter. See, again, this is the point, right? So let's start with this. And there's a lot to get to in what you said there. Like, your point that you seem to be making is twofold. You seem to be making point that reparations are important because of financial disparities. My argument would be any solving of that financial disparity or attempt to solve it or money's gone to it, even if it's not said this is specifically only for slaves, if it disproportionately goes to that group, I don't think that that's a reason that we shouldn't be allowed to call that a form of reparation. Secondly, the idea that there needs to be a specific acknowledgement. There have been forms of this specific acknowledgments for the problems of slavery. I don't think that this does much to solve things. If I was a Black person who was struggling and the government said, here's your two options, we could apologize for slavery or we could give you $25,000 home loan, I'd take the loan. That's what I would do. So the idea, so when you're like, well, you know, the $3.75 trillion, you don't dispute the fact, you just say, well, that's available to other people. That's true. But Blacks overwhelmingly are the ones that are getting that, at least vis-a-vis whites, at a much higher rate. So how would that not be a form? And the idea that it's like, well, that money wasn't designed to like create generational wealth. Okay, well, if 3.75 trillion over 50 years wasn't enough to do it, and you're admitting that 10 trillion would bankrupt the country, what are we supposed to do? It doesn't make any sense from a financial, like, it's like, to me, this further entrenches the point that what I was saying. It doesn't matter. We could do your plan. And I'll take it your good faith that you'd be like, that's it. We do whatever your plan is, a study, and we, you know, give education grants and land grants and small business loans and all portions of that. I know I'm not pigeonholing you on specific what you're saying here, but the next Black author would come along and say, it wasn't enough. It's still not enough. We don't accept it. In 2 years after your plan, if we still saw that there was increased crime rates and there was increased poverty and the money was spent frivolously because of cultural practices as opposed to attempts to build businesses and generational wealth, they'd still be saying, it's because of slavery, it's because of Jim Crow, which proves that this isn't actually going to solve anything. It's just about making people feel good and say, I want to continue to have the power to say I'm oppressed. And we see how groups that claim they're oppressed today use that as a cudgel in order to demand more power. That's all it is.
Let me throw this out there. I don't want the continued oppression narrative to exist. So I'm going to make this abundantly clear. I've said on multiple podcasts, I've said this on CJ Pearson's show, I've said this recently with Blanche, that, and even with Lala Andrews, shout out to Lala, that once this is done, like let's say I became the president, like I was able to push through Congress. Once you get the home ownership line of credit, once you get the education grants, once you get that, I don't want to hear it. To your point, does that mean they'll stop complaining? Absolutely not. I wouldn't be foolish enough to make the statement. But the point is, I would no longer give a damn. And I don't think anyone should. Once a targeted, measurable, directed effort has been given to Black Americans to say, starting, like I said, starting with the same form of public apology the government gave the Japanese Americans, that it gave the API Asian and Pacific Islander Americans. Though once that's done, I don't want to hear anything else about racism, because that does create the ability to sustain a victim mentality, which is dangerous to an already damaged body politic in the black community. We have a out of wedlock birth crisis. We have a mental health crisis in the Black community. We got a whole lot of other issues that we need to deal with. This is one large cog in a very, very large machine. And I don't want you or anyone that watches this debate to misunderstand my position here, because I'm not for spoon feeding you repeatedly. I'm not for giving you fishes. I'm for teaching you to fish, and get the hell out and go make something of yourself. Now that's where the left will always attempt to pigeonhole you, and that's where the right will say, well, how much is, to your point, Rob, when is enough enough? In my brain, a targeted plan like this is enough. Now, but I also don't want it, I don't want to drift away too far here. The idea, once again, though, that welfare is reparations, that would only make logical sense to me if some form of government assistance, some form of a guaranteed basic income went to the descendants of all of these people. That doesn't happen. Welfare specifically goes to low-income Americans and low-income communities to allow them the very, very basic necessities of life with very limited room, if any, for mobile social uplift. Because once someone makes too much money within welfare, what happens? You're kicked off. Now, I don't have a problem with that,
because let Rob respond to that before you put out too many points. That's a good.
I still want to get back to redlining, but let me address this here. Like, this generational sin narrative makes no sense to me from a practical sense. It could only make sense from sort of just this ethical, like, we demand an apology sense. And let me explain why. Let's say that there are two babies born to single mothers side by side in the same location in the same hospital. They're literally in opposing rooms. And one is a black lady with a black boy. We'll call him Bob, just B for, black. So Bob's a little black baby. And then there's a white single woman who right next to her is giving birth to Will, a single white baby. And both of them are the exact same financial situation. Both of them are single mothers. Both of them are struggling. They live in the same community. They live in the same apartment complex. They both are less than $10,000 a year. They're on government assistance. Why should there be a unique program for Bob, the young black child, that gives him more resources than Will, the young white child?
Well, let's be clear. And that's a great point. I should have addressed that initially, and I didn't. Thank you for catching that. Dr. King is quoted as saying that the same, and this is again provable also, that the same forces that oppressed at that time Black Americans also impacted poor whites. So any solid reparations program could look at the net negative disparate economic impact that slavery or reparations had on either poor white Americans or Black Americans as a whole, either one. No reparations plan, I want this on the record as well, no reparations plan will pass a United States Supreme Court review if it's purely race-based. We just saw that with the Voting Rights Act, what the Supreme Court did, that they stated that you, even while trying to follow the law, you cannot use race as a qualifier or as a metric to draw voting districts. A lot of people are confused about that, but that's what happened. So it would have to be any successful reparations plan would have to target those that were disaffected based on class or race being used as a determining factor. So I'm thank you for catching.
Okay, but given that, then I see no reason that welfare policy couldn't be deemed a form of reparations. The distinguishing factors. Let me finish real quick. It seemed that the distinguishing factor you said that was of note was, well, that's because it wasn't specifically for racism or for slavery, but you just admitted there, no policy just based on a single race would be allowed to thrive. We wouldn't be allowed to do it. So even reparations wouldn't be exclusive to blacks, because if a white person could claim that they too were victimized by slavery in some way, shape, or form, they would be entitled as well. And it's interesting because, just real quick, I promise I'll be brief. I was looking at this. I was kind of shocked to find the amount of, I don't have the specific numbers in front of me. I'll find it here, but it's a very small proportion of whites today who had ancestors that were actually slave owners. It's like 8%, but it's actually as high as 15%. Or I'm sorry, as high as 10% that had an ancestor that died freeing the slaves, and as much as 20% that fought in the Union freeing the slaves of people that are alive today. I certainly could make a claim that because of my patriarch and my family died at Gettysburg fighting to free the slaves, that set my family back generationally because we couldn't afford to keep the farm and therefore we lost it. So would I be entitled to the same reparations you're discussing?
You may be. You may be. That's a valid argument. I was going to also say that you could look at white Americans that died and were killed or their families were harmed because they marched with civil rights workers. Again, if, like I said, even if we confine this to just Jim Crow, I'm with you there. If you made a positive effort toward Black Americans and you lost your life, or a family member lost their life, or you lost jobs, and you could prove that and you could demonstrate, because what we would have to categorize this as is targeted government-based harm, which we can prove that with the decisions that had to take place, like Brown versus Board of Education, going all the way back to the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision. There was a point in American history where the U.S. government codified simply that Black Americans were not humans. They were property. They were things to be used, not persons to be respected. And if you can prove, I'll grant this, if you can prove that you assisted in the overturning of an unjust system and that led to a loss of life, property, damage to your economic standing, then it could be made that you should deserve something. I think you should honor people that took the step to assist in correcting an injustice. So I wouldn't have an issue with that. No.
But again, this is where I'm going to take umbrage, because notice you're using words like deserve. None of us deserve anything. None of us are the victims of slavery, nor are we the perpetrators of slavery. And you talk about the government decisions themselves, but as I said in my opening statement, the government is just a body that's made up of the people alive today. And so, for example, when you're talking about the payment of, that's just a collective of all of us that are taxpayers. Some white, some Black, some immigrant, some Hispanic, some Asian, etc. It's a big milieu of people. And the idea that they should have to put into a pot people that we think deserve things for historical oppression quickly spirals out of control. There's no shortage of people that could claim that they were aggrieved by the government. If Big Mike here's great uncle, one time had his property taken in an eminent domain case, and they ended up later finding oil on it, does Mike now get to claim some 200 years later reparations because he was entitled to the wealth of that oil? All of this is just surely something that's unworkable, particularly when we can see that these programs already exist that you're talking about. Not only is there trillions of dollars that are spent in this reparations that disproportionately go to the people that had ancestors of slavery, but we also see that there's programs very much like the ones you're saying. There are a litany of programs at the federal governments, at the state government, and just private businesses that are doing things specifically for Black Americans. So much so, you talk about redlining, I'm happy to get into that because it's a debate I think is very important we should have. But I could claim, my great-grandson could claim reparations that he wants because we have banks like JP Morgan that are having loans specifically for Blacks now. Does that mean, in effect, whites in the same economic pool are now being redlined? How is that fair? Is that entitled my ancestors to reparations for that redlining?
Yeah, first of all, that's a horrendously bad argument. I'm sorry, that argument just doesn't stand to reason. Black people were systematically excluded from even the obtaining of loans, period, for over 100 years in this nation. And so the idea that somehow any corrective action to attempt to give Black people what, when the scales become equal, things don't become unfair. You just might not be used to it. I mean, that might be the case. I would hate to think that a white person would scream, "Oh my God, this is discrimination because Black people are now getting finally the same amount of loans they should have had from the beginning." That's a foolish notion. The fact of the matter is simply this: when you look at what has occurred in the confines of the history of this nation, Black people were systemically excluded from the basic building block of wealth generation, which is home ownership, for a long period of time. So if you, again, confine what I'm saying, even if you took out slavery, which again, you shouldn't, but let's say we are, you confine it specifically to the Jim Crow era, after post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction, you confine it to the Jim Crow era, and Black people still deserve, yes, something as an apology and a economic corrective action. That's what DEI's original intent was supposed to be. And it's so interesting because it didn't cost the nation 1 penny to integrate a lunch counter. It didn't cost the nation 1 penny to guarantee the right to vote. And the United States of America has spent more than $173 billion, for example, on the war in Iran. It's always, when we have to go to war, the money it falls from the sky. When it's time to actually combat poverty, and I'm going to say this last point, I'm going to be done. Now we have to go find the money. Even going back to the war in Vietnam, at that time, the United States spent $100,000 for every Vietnamese soldier we killed. Yet at the time, the U.S. government was only spending around $53 to actually, for every person in the country that was classified as poor. So even with you said it was about $10 trillion we're getting from welfare. The majority of that money, I would imagine, and we can look this up, is going to administrative costs, and very little of that money actually dwindles down to the end consumer, which is the disaffected class living in the impoverished conditions that keep them on welfare. So that this idea that the government, it would cost too much money, it's nonsensical. We know where the money is in one area, but when it's time to combat poverty, it disappears.
Okay, so a lot to say there. First, you're sort of wrong. I said 3.75 trillion, not 10 trillion, but that's literally just the Census Bureau looking at the actual cash that gets to the actual recipients. And the median, on the average, what we see is that blacks receive 2,500 to 3,300 more than whites per capita per person, right? Now, you are correct when you talk about overhead and all that shit. But those numbers are just talking about the money that gets to the people. But that belies the other point you're making here, which is, look how much money we spend on war. I'm sure as a Republican, you know this, right? The vast amount of spending we do, defense is like fifth on the amount of spending. Like, social programs are by far number one. We give a shitload of money out to people in all sorts of programs, whether it be Medicaid, whether it be SNAP benefits, whether it be different forms of welfare benefits. So again, we can see that over the past 50 years, the net benefit to the black community has been $3.75 trillion. And that's just if we take the dollars. That's not to take a bunch of other things like affirmative action opportunities, DEI opportunities, and a bunch of other things. Secondly, you sort of made this claim that I think goes against something you said earlier. You started to like sort of defend DI policies, and you said when it came to the nature of redlining, you were like, well, that's just correcting a past injustice. I don't think that we should be allowed to, for example, met out slavery against white people because their ancestors owned slaves in the past. Of course, you would agree with that. But the principle remains then we shouldn't be able to punish people today for sins of the past. And that's in effect what we'd be doing. And I think you agree with this. You want to know how I think you agree with this? You went to great lengths that said, of course, we couldn't do a policy just based on race, which is already conceding the debate because the topic of the debate is that the reparations was be race-based. And you even said it wouldn't even go through the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court just ruled on the redistricting case and the Voting Rights Act case that you can't have race-based districts. Totally true. So then for you to advocate DEI and specific programs that only give wealth to blacks would violate the same principle that you just got done saying you wouldn't do. So you can't have it both ways. And last thing I'll say, it's non-responsive to what I would. It's non-responsive to the argument I'm making about redlining, which is now we see, yeah, maybe there were some whites that had families that benefited from slavery and their ancestors are doing really well right now. But I know a ton of whites that aren't, who are, I'm up north, they never whatsoever benefited from slavery.
All right, let's let Dr. Julio add one of those.
Last point I'm going to make just very quick, right? And so in order... Okay.
Say this. You're literally missing. You're not addressing the core of what I'm getting at. The reason I said that the way that a purely race-based reparations plan wouldn't pass the U.S. Supreme Court is because I understand how legal systems work. That doesn't mean that the way the law would be written would be as best as possible to specifically target a reparations-based plan where the chief recipient is disenfranchised black voters, the same way that DEI policies were written in a way that chiefly benefited white women. On the surface, you get to say, "Oh, DEI, that's black people. That's your reparations plan right there. That's what it is." But the actual net benefactors weren't even the targeted group, supposedly, which was black Americans, supposedly. The most affected class and the greatest recipient and benefactor of DEI policies, based on the way the law was written, was white women. So the way that I would write the law would pass a judicial review at the Supreme Court. I'm showing you that I'm understanding the legalities of what I'm dealing with here. But I'm not going to sit and say that a reparations-based policy could not be written to most properly affect the most targeted class from Jim Crow and slavery by extension, which was who? Black Americans. So don't try to say that I conceded the debate when I didn't. I'm just demonstrating that I understand the legal framework that would have to be used to get something like this through the U.S. Supreme Court for review. The same way that Congressman Rob...
Yeah, let's let Rob finish that point a second ago. I didn't want to cut him off, but I did want a quick chance because I didn't want it to go too far and miss the original part of that statement.
You also said that you would be for ancestors that were white that fought to end slavery getting reparations. So clearly your central claim isn't that it would be race-based. And the other point that I was making before you chimed in was, if there's a person today, a white person, whatever the reason is that they're not doing so well financially, and now because of DEI policies or because of these redlining policies that favor blacks over whites that many banks are doing post George Floyd, right? What ends up happening is they have a grievance now. And their grandchildren could say, hey, it wasn't fair. My grandfather was more in need and he was prepared. He had the business plan. He was more qualified than the person that ended up receiving it. Purely based because of his skin color. And to say, well, that's about correcting past injustices, that ends up leading us to a point, not just in the United States, but across the world, where there's always a unique time point that we put. The group that's saying, I want paid, pay me because of this historical justice, they're taking a favorable time slice and saying, because of this time period right here. But if then we said, okay, if you reverse those policies, right, it's going to negatively impact people today, right? And they're going to have a claim 50 years from now and saying, well, 50 years ago, we were negatively impacted. And then what's your answer going to be? Yeah, but that's because 200 years ago, we were negatively impacted. So it's just this never ending cycle of victimhood that's not going to make things better. And again, these programs largely exist to what you're talking about. I could go through a litany of them if you like, but I know you know they exist. Specific policies from the federal government, Small Business Administration, affirmative action policies to give guaranteed sort of grants or scholarships to Black Americans, etc. These all exist. Now, if you'd like, I would love to talk about redlining. I think that's one of your best arguments, and I would love to take it head on if you'd like.
Well, before we jump to redlining, you skipped a part there. You said that the U.S. Did you say that what is the number one thing the U.S. government spends most of its money on?
It's like entitlements, I believe.
That's
Like
a lie.
social
The
program.
single largest category of discretionary federal spending in the United States is defense spending through the U.S. DoD and related national security operations. And the largest total federal spending categories are Social Security, Medicare and health. Third is defense. Fourth is interest on the national debt. Fifth is Medicaid. So that's not the idea that the number one budget item on the U.S. is entitlement programs is simply not historically true. The number one budget item has always been defense. That is current as of a couple hours ago. So that's just utter nonsense.
I would love to say, I hate to say this, but I believe we have a discrepancy because I looked at this earlier today as well.
I'm
just
looking
think
at it right now.
What source are you looking at? Because what I'm looking at is rank one is Social Security that spends $1.46 trillion, which is 21%. Second is healthcare, mainly Medicaid and other health programs, which is $991 billion. Third is Medicare, which is $874 billion. Fourth is national defense, which is $874 billion.
So
and then fifth is national
government
interest.
transparency reports the source on that, and Fed spend.
Okay, what was it?
Government. So it's Government Transparency Project, published March 13th, 2026, and Fed Spend, and USA Facts. There's three sources that confirm the same
Can
information.
you just put one of them on screen? I'm cool. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But everything I've read here recently,
I'm looking at it on my
even
phone
politicians
here.
agree with
I'm
this.
looking at it. The government. I can't put it on the screen here, but it's the government. Mike, it's the governmenttransparencyproject.org. And it was the breakdown of department by department breakdown of fiscal year 2025 spending. It says in fiscal year 2025, the federal government spent $7 trillion. Three agencies alone consumed 2/3 of it, and it was the Department of Health and Human Services, Social Security Administration, and the Department of Defense. They accounted for 66.8% of all federal gross spending.
Okay, I'm going to try something. I'm very bad at this, but I'm going to try to share a source. I'm not going to be able to do it. I'll say this. I am reading directly from the United States Treasury, fiscaldata.treasury.gov. And this says for the fiscal year 2026. So the last year is 2025 that it has. It says U.S. government spending, fiscal year 2026, top 10 spending by category and agency. Number one, 22% of all spending, Social Security. Number two, net interest. Number three, health. Number four, Medicare. And number five, national defense. Now, I don't know how we could pass this. I would suggest the audience look up themselves. I don't think either of us are intentionally lying, but I wonder if your source is somehow different or if you're reading the data incorrectly, because everything that I've checked going back years has showed this is the case, that defense is not in the top. It's not the top one. Nonetheless, I don't think it's a very important point for the gist of the debate. I think that I will do my due diligence to look it up afterwards.
It's a hugely important point because it creates this idea that Black people are somehow the number or poor, the poor in America are the number one most targeted class financially by the U.S. government. That is not true. The number one budget item in the United States has always been defense. We spend billions of dollars. Again, going all the way back to King in the 60s. We spent $100,000 per Vietnamese soldier killed. And we spent $53 at that time on people in the U.S. classified as poor. This is why Smedley D. Butler wrote the great essay that said war is a racket. It is the ultimate economic activity in America, for it is the one where the profits are only reckoned in dollars and the losses in lives. So war has always been the United States' number one budget item, period, point blank, end of discussion with it as regards to that.
I think you're just fundamentally wrong.
Let me make this last point. When we finally get to the point where the United States continues to stop or stops continuing to spend more money on war and the Department of Defense than it does on programs of genuine social uplift, then the three problems of excessive militarism and excessive crony capitalism will not be corrected. Period, point blank in the story. What I'm saying doesn't just apply to Black Americans.
Can you repeat that? I'm so sorry. I think that's important. You said when we have other things that spend more than war, we'll start to solve that problem?
When we stop spending more on war than we do spend on programs of social uplift, we'll see better changes as a whole for all of the poor and the lower middle class in this country. That's my point.
Okay, well, given that you're wrong, that we already are spending more on the categories I said above war.
We're not spending more on that than
we just are. I don't know what to tell you, and I hope to be able to prove this to you at a later date. I don't know what I could do other than link the source from the actual Treasury that shows that, and almost all sources that look at this stuff acknowledge. So I don't know what you're reading, but given that, I think that we're largely. I wasn't. Let me just.
Are you going to say?
Please.
Are you going to say? Is we're going to
finish this last thought?
Go ahead.
I would just say to the audience, I implore you, look it up yourself. Go to the Treasury. You'll see defense is like 4th or 5th, and it has been that way for a long time. And so given his explanation, that means that we don't need reparations then, that we've solved the problem because now we're not spending the most on war. He's just mistaken that he thinks war is still and defense is still the top item.
Oh, no, I mean, I think, we don't, I mean, the fact is, this is a very crucial thing. We just, look at how much money, we can look this up now. How much money has Trump spent on the war in Iran? How much money has the president of the United States currently spent on the war in Iran? That's a very simple, searchable question. And then we can compare that to how much money has gone to those genuine entitlement programs like SNAP benefits and welfare and things like that. We just had a government shutdown because there wasn't enough money for SNAP. So that's a proof positive right there that what I'm saying is the truth. And this is from a president that I have to hold him accountable, voted for him. And I don't have buyer's remorse, but I'm beginning to look at the Trump administration more and more like, is this a Bush repeat? Are the neocons just going to play the war game again? And so this is not I don't want to drag this out longer than necessary, but war is the number one budget item. And this is a historical pattern in the United States. You can look at why we got involved in World War II. They claim that World War II brought us out of the Depression when we didn't even have to go through one if FDR would have never taken us off the gold standard. The same thing with World War I. The same thing with Vietnam. The first thing Lyndon Johnson did after the assassination of Kennedy was make sure that the United States was dragged into war, because war is always the number one economic activity that the oligarchs want us to participate in.
Okay, I just think that we could... you could see that just because you could say, well, now Trump's spending a lot on war, I don't think that changes the data. I don't know where we are. We're at an impasse. I'd like to talk about redlining a little. This is something that you focused on a lot and that others have. The problem is redlining actually fell in line with governmental policy that sort of makes sense. Would you agree with this? Let's start with this. As a conservative, do you remember when that bakery had to bake the cake? The Supreme Court at one point said they had to bake a cake. Or the courts, not the Supreme, said that they had to bake a cake for a gay wedding. Do you remember that? And were you against forcing them?
I remember that. Yeah.
Were you against forcing them to do that?
In that context, yes.
Yeah, I think that we would probably
that fell under a religious exemption.
Sure, but whatever. We would say that you not just religious exemption. At least for me, maybe you would agree with this. You could just agree if you do. We shouldn't tell businesses that they have to do things that's just against what they want to do morally. And what we do is
I'm not going to concede that. At one point, businesses lunch counters didn't have to serve black people. I'm not agreeing to the statement you just made. No.
Do you think that they should have to serve black people if it meant that they would go out of business?
Why would how stupid does that sound?
Let me explain with redlining.
No, wait, let me get the question out in full. Why would a restaurant go out of business for the service of black people?
I said it because I'm drawing an analogy directly to redlining, because that's in effect what redlining was seeking to avoid. So lenders in the FHA observed correctly. This comes from a black man, Thomas Sowell, who wrote this. He says that redlining was actually the same. An analogy would be a high crime neighborhood. You're redlining a high crime neighborhood because you refuse to walk there at night to protect your safety. Banks have the same duty to depositors' money. They deny loans in high risk areas. It's prudent and not bigoted. These lenders observed that areas with high black populations or infiltration of groups that didn't get it wrong ethnically experienced declining property values. And the data actually bore this out. The default rates were similar when this happened. After the federal government stepped in and said, nope, this is called redlining. You can't do this. You want to know what happened? Formerly, before that, blacks and whites that got loans defaulted at almost the exact equal rate. As soon as they ended redlining, now the banks had to give loans out that they knew were unlikely to be paid, and blacks defaulting on the loans precipitously increased. So all this was banks saying, look, we don't want to lend areas that we think we won't be paid back because property values are being destroyed. I don't think we should force those banks, which is exactly what was done. And now I'm not saying you have to like what happened there, but this was a very small percentages of loans that occurred, and it was done for a financial reason, not a bigoted reason. Why does that mean that now, in some point, hundreds of years later, or near 100 years later, right? Because it started in 1930s when they started looking at it, and it ended in the 60s. Why should now all of a sudden someone like me, who doesn't have any ancestors that were in the banking industry, right, didn't benefit from this whatsoever? Why should my taxes go to pay reparations?
So wait a minute, because you said something about redlining, then you jumped to reparations. You're saying the quotation you gave from Thomas Sowell is what I need to address. Are you saying that Sowell was claiming, because I'm trying to make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying that Sowell was claiming that the reason black people were not given loans is because they couldn't pay the loans back?
No, I'm saying what happened was that it was leading to it, the property values being lowered, and that led to a less likely chance of the banks being paid back. And it was borne out by, last thing I'll say, it's borne out by fact, because as soon as the federal government stepped in and said banks couldn't do this, the defaults for black Americans went through the roof. You even brought it up last thing real quick. You brought it up in your opening statement.
I'm asking you to go back to what you said. I'm trying to understand.
Yes.
What was causing the value of the homes to be lower?
That there was racial disharmony. So what would happen would be, if you were a white community in the Jim Crow South that didn't particularly like blacks, then you weren't happy with whites moving in. Similarly, if you were a Filipino community and whites moved in, or a black community and whites moved in, that too would lower home values. We see it today with the concept of gentrification. For example, when whites try to move into inner city Harlem, we can see that affects property prices there as well. Sometimes positive, sometimes negative, because the local population doesn't want people that are dissimilar to them and have different cultural practices living in their communities.
So as extensively detailed in The Color of Law, that's the partial truth. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, created during the New Deal era in the 1930s, produced maps of American cities that literally graded neighborhoods for mortgage lending purposes. Neighborhoods were typically color-coded. Green was best, blue was still desirable, yellow was definitely declining, and red was hazardous. The term redlining comes from those maps. The presence of black residents was explicitly often treated as a negative initial factor in determining neighborhood stability and lending desirability. Homeownership loan corporations areas, the descriptions repeatedly reference what they call Negro infiltration, racial composition, immigrant population, and inharmonious racial groups as a risk factor. So the mere presence of black Americans drove down the value of property going as far back as the 1930s. So this idea that somehow there was no racial harmony that existed and that was the initial cause is simply not a historical truth. And that comes from Rich Rothstein, who wrote the book, The Color of Law, which actually documented the redlining process and the history of redlining throughout this country. And his years of study included 1930 all the way through 1969.
Yes, I agree. Thomas Sowell's looking at that data, and what you said just agreed with me. Yes, it wasn't that these banks were racist.
Let me finish. Sowell is not accounting for that.
No, he's absolutely accounting for that. When blacks moved into the neighborhood, whites wanted to leave. They didn't want it. Why should the banks be held responsible for that? Should the banks be forced to take a loss? And similarly today, let's just take the example today. Certainly, I live in a predominantly white area, but certainly the blacks that I know that grew up in around this area culturally are more similar to me than they are different. And yet, if we all of a sudden had Section 8 housing that moved in, that brought in a bunch of inner city blacks, I'd move.
What you're ignoring,
blacks are something like 47 times more likely to commit a violent crime against a white than vice versa. And
Rob,
so
what you're deliberately ignoring, though, which is amazing to me, when that's what the term white flight was. Home ownership values were driven down simply because black people wanted to live in a particular area. That
True.
in and of itself, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I agree. We're in agreement.
That in and of itself, that shows how the white power structure was able to systematically subjugate and regulate, both directly and indirectly, property value, which is a problem. Because the only reason that white people wanted to move away and the reason white flight existed was because they didn't like black people moving into particular areas. So the entire rationale you just provided has a literal racial underpinning, which is another reason that black people were not able to not pay back the loans, not able to move into certain places without their home value being labeled the same as whites. And this is yet another reason why some form of reparations to combat redlining is a logical point.
Okay, so two things. One, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm saying either legitimately or illegitimately, at the time, whites didn't want to live around blacks. Perhaps they thought that there would have been crime that came in. Perhaps they were just racist jerks and there wouldn't have been increased crime. That's irrelevant to the story of the banks and the federal government. And whether or not let me finish. What you're saying is there were individual racist white people, but you're not saying that we should have to pay reparations today because there was some Jim Crow guy in 1930 that was racist against a black. You're saying it's because of these banks and these government policies. And what I'm telling you is we would be in agreement that we wouldn't force a bank to lend money that they knew they were going to lose out on. And when the government stepped in, guess what happened? The defaults actually went through the roof, particularly with black Americans. We can see this in the 2008 financial crisis. One of the things that happened were banks, this time because they were playing a shell game, decided that they would be able to intentionally give loans to people that they knew would be incapable of paying back those loans. Then they marked them as AAA so that they then sold them to people in their 401k that bought them, all the while knowing that there was likely to be a default. When those defaults started rolling in, guess what happened? Joe Schmo worker, whether it be a white guy or a black guy, all of a sudden his retirement gone, just like that, because the banks were intentionally giving loans out to people that they knew weren't going to be able to pay it back, whether because the property values would be driven down or because they weren't making enough income or there were other risk factors. Right. And so what I'm saying is you could say there were racist whites in 1930. Agreed. What's that have to do with today and reparations? And we can see the inverse of this is true. Whites are damned if they do, damned if they don't. If they say we don't want Section 8 housing in our neighborhood, they're racist. If they say I love Harlem, I want to move in there, then they're gentrifying and they're racist. It's also tiresome, and it just shows that the actual way to deal with this isn't by trying to have. Now the suggestion is we actually have redlining against whites.
All right, Rob,
and when
let's
I bring
let him
it up,
respond to one of those points.
Last point, real quick. We have redlining against whites, and when I bring it up to you, you're just like, so what? It's to solve historical inadequacies. So why shouldn't my grandchild be able to complain about redlining against whites that's occurring today?
Thank you, sir.
Because for one, I mean, this is the chief thing. This is another chief thing. White people not only systematically kept property values low, they also attacked black businesses when they began to be started up. I mean, you have to go back at the Tulsa Massacre. You have to look at what happened to Black Wall Street. The reason your white grandchildren wouldn't be able to complain about some sort of quote unquote reverse redlining policy is because the net of it is white people have historically controlled and dominated the economic, socioeconomic, and political power structure of this nation for 244 years plus. So this idea that somehow your grandchildren would be disaffected or disenfranchised by some policy that is meant to help a previously generationally disavowed and negatively affected minority is simply nonsense. And that's the only response that I have to that.
No, but the point is that I have no problem if you say this particular person was aggrieved. Like if we jail someone, right, and it turns out they were innocent and the government screwed up, we pay them for that. I get that. What we don't do is pay 3 generations later. We don't do that. That's nonsensical because what happens is a never-ending loop, right? Because if we pay now, we say because of historical oppression. I have nothing to do with that. You have nothing to do with being the victim of that. We are in the financial circumstances we're in right now. Let's say that we're equal. Like we literally make the same money. Maybe we're both doing well. Maybe we're both struggling. Your reason might be because of bad things that happened to your ancestors with the U.S. government. Mine might be that my grandpa was a drunk and he spoiled the land and the business that was given to him. What's that have to do with me or you? So when you say, well, because of the actions of my grandpa and your grandpa, now I need to be negatively affected and not get the same access to resources as you, then my grandchild will say, okay, if I go back immediately 2 generations, I've been negatively affected, and your grandchild will be able to be one that benefited. So my grandchild will say, that's not fair. And just because you say, yeah, but if we go back 200 years earlier, who cares? The impact right now from 2 generations ago is bigger than the impact from 10 generations ago. So it's never ending. And there's all sorts of problems we won't be able to get into in the scope of this debate because of the time. But there's just this assertion that the problem with the wealth disparity is because of Jim Crow. That's just not true. And in fact, I think it's more likely because of these programs. For example, Asian Americans outperform whites and blacks. We had alien land laws and yellow peril and citizens bans. They were legally classified as aliens ineligible from citizenship until the McCarran-Walter Act in 1952. Most of the time not allowed to own property. That's well after Jim Crow. Most of Jim Crow ended where blacks were allowed to own property. So the idea that then all of a sudden now they're outperforming whites and this was a white supremacist society or a society set up to benefit whites, then how are Asians doing better? The answer you previously gave was they were immigrants and therefore they're given beneficial programs. Couldn't be further from the truth for Asian Americans. Most of their ancestors faked the Alien Exclusion Act, faced these yellow laws that said that they couldn't own land, it couldn't be citizenships. They're doing amazing because they didn't embrace the victimhood mindset and say the government owes us this stuff. They achieved on their own. And had blacks done that 70, 80 years ago, instead of relying on welfare and the war on poverty, they would be in a similar situation most likely.